about this time every year, we tend to teach Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol to the undeserving young of South London who are filled with enthusiasm for it. But one of the parts that always gets a little bit of engagement is about the comparison between conditions in Victorian England and the present day, and sharing some of the horror stories from Victorian England about injuries in the workplace, child labour, and the general conditions of working class life, and the complete lack of a safety net obviously leads to a whole series of questions and discussion. Now, obviously, the capitalist class, in responding to why 200 years later conditions are different, often focus on the supposed benevolence of philanthropists and the capitalist class, a kind of general improvement in technology and the quality of life, and completely ignore the fact that any improvements that we have seen, including the expectation that the vast majority of workers enter their workplace fairly safe in the knowledge that they are going to return home in at least one piece, if slightly bedraggled, that has come off the back of seismic struggles of the working class. Those struggles in the 19th century, in the formation and the emergence of the trade union movement that began to address the conditions in the workplace, the struggles during the Spanish flu pandemic, which are often glossed over as well. 1/5 of American workers took strike action during the Spanish flu pandemic. And of course, all of the other struggles that led to changes in legislation and the practices of employers. It's not an accident that the 1974 Health and Safety Act came off the back of a period of really intense workers' struggle, the victory of the miners' strike in 1972, and the toppling of the Heath government. So we need to kind of see it in the context that what we're talking about in terms of protecting the safety of workers is based on the relative strength of the organised working class. And this pandemic has really brought into sharp focus the question of health and safety for workers, and also it's brought into sharp focus the role and the relative strength of the trade union movement. And this is going to come even more to a head later this week, on Wednesday, when workers considered by the government clinically extremely vulnerable will be instructed to return to their workplaces, in many cases entering their workplaces again if they choose to do so, knowing that it could have a serious impact on their health and even on their life. In the UK, we've obviously seen the country break the 50,000 death barrier before any other European country. And obviously we can, a concentration on deaths figures is very important, but there are the unreported impacts as well in terms of the long-term health implications for those who've contracted COVID and the other kind of associated impacts in terms of health and well-being. But we also need to remind ourselves that those figures would have been higher had workers not taken action to try and address the question of the spread of COVID-19 that pushed and had an impact on some of the political decisions that have been made to protect workers. If we look at some of the action that's been taken, and I don't want to steal anyone on this call's thunder, and I'll let them tell their own stories, but we've seen action in Linden Foods in the north of Ireland, and the ASOS factory in Barnsley over the question of social distancing. We've seen refuse workers organise and win important victories in Bexley, for example, where they won on conditions and the sackings of workers, and actually improved trade union density there from 25% to an excellent 95% density in that workplace. The same with refuse workers in Medway taking action. And we've seen a growth in a number of significant areas in terms of trade union membership. 16,000 new Unison members, 20,000 new members of my union, the NEU, and in Unite, in the hospitality sector, which is obviously a sector that's been incredibly exposed by the pandemic, and some of the working practices and conditions that exist in that sector has seen Unite's membership in hospitality rise by 11.4%. And what that's an indication of, obviously, is that workers draw the conclusion that in a crisis, that in order of what needs to be done, in many cases, the conclusion that is being drawn is that collective action is important to defend conditions, to defend health, and to defend safety. That's been reflected internationally as well. We've seen French lab workers going out on strike over workloads, completely overwhelmed by the weight of their work during the pandemic. We've seen workers in Amazon warehouses and a number of places across the United States organising over health and safety and other issues, including victimisation of trade union reps that I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. But we've also seen action taken that goes beyond just the kind of defensive struggles. Workers at General Electric in America taking action demanding that their production be repurposed to make ventilators, which I think really shows the potential for a mass movement of the organised working class to not only address some of the immediate concerns that the pandemic has thrown up, but also to begin to roll back some of the attacks that have taken place over the last few decades. We've also seen healthcare workers all over the world taking different forms of action in defence of their safety and over their working conditions in Papua New Guinea, in Pakistan, in the US, and obviously here in the UK. And while a lot of strike ballots and strike action is reported numerically in the newspapers, what's often not reported are those unofficial actions, or those actions that are short of strike action that have had an impact on working conditions in key workplaces. So comrades of ours who work in the health sector have reported how at the height of the crisis around the provision of PPE, at the beginning of the pandemic, health workers set red lines for their managers of what the expectations should be in their workplace for them to work safely, and scored important victories that maybe won't make the headlines in the news, but have had a huge impact on people's lives. And really, I think when we look at these struggles as Marxists, and we try and understand the processes developing and point a way forward, what we are seeing is we are seeing in many cases on those examples around the world and here in Britain of workers trying to struggle for more control over what happens in their workplace, what happens to them as individuals and to their colleagues and the wider community. And I think it's worth us reflecting maybe for a moment on what we do have control over as workers in our individual workplaces. And I encouraged comrades when we were discussing the question of workers' control in the NEU caucus of Socialist Alternative to think about what we have control over, what we might have some input into in terms of negotiations and our trade union groups, and what is still dictated to us by managers in our workplace. And part of these struggles has been about trying to shift what is dictated to us and what we have no impact and no input into, to shift that balance to ensure that we're able to shape what happens. And so that means that workplace reps across the country have been fighting to even get meetings with management regularly to address some of these concerns, to be able to know what is happening in their workplaces in terms of positive cases and transparency around the impact of the virus. And these battles will continue and do continue on a daily basis right across workplaces in the country, and we need to give that shape, we need to give it direction, and we need to give it a programme that can win. Now, I've mentioned a whole number of individual strikes of groups of workers. I didn't mention some of the unofficial walkouts that have taken place. Perhaps Rob, as our one of our resident posties, can maybe talk about the role of some of the unofficial action within the CWU. But in my borough, we saw cleaners at the local hospital take unofficial action at the beginning of the pandemic, heroically putting their jobs on the line in order to push management back and to win significant concessions on PPE, cleaning and so on. But we might want to question, why is it that we haven't seen generalised action nationally from the trade union movement, which numbers more than 6.5 million workers? Why is it that that hasn't developed as a struggle nationally? And I think you only need to see the pictures of Francis O'Grady, the General Secretary of the TUC, who at the height of the pandemic chose not to stand on picket lines or in mass meetings organising workers, but instead to stand outside number 11, flanking the Chancellor Rishi Sunak and praising their decisive action, also echoed by other leading trade union leaders, including McCluskey of Unite as well. And what that's a reflection of is a shift in terms of a kind of form of class collaboration, where trade union leaders have very little confidence in collective action, in strike action, in workers using their industrial strengths, and have moved to rely on lobbying and kind of reasoned arguments and appeals to the capitalist class. And we can see really the motivations of the capitalist class in the comments that were leaked about Dominic Cummings right at the beginning of the pandemic, who effectively brushed away the deaths, the projected deaths of the elderly in Britain as necessary collateral damage in order for their system to continue. So we must be absolutely blunt that we can have no faith in the kind of reason of the capitalist class to keep us safe or to provide for us. We have to rely on our own organisation and our own strength. And the thing that has held us back so much during the crisis, but also in the whole period of the Tory government, has been the inability and the unwillingness of trade union leaders to draw the conclusion that it's necessary to confront the government, it's necessary to organise, it's necessary to use the collective strength of the movement. And this is incredibly important when we think about what is also coming down the tracks. We're still not out of the health crisis. Talk of a virus and things potentially beginning to return to relative normality in the new year will be used to try and quiet dissenting voices and to quiet those who might be raising concerns. But we're certainly not out of the health crisis right now. In Lewisham, in the NEU here, in the absence of any national action, we have taken the decision to try to have borough-wide action, to try and win an agreement for schools in our borough. Our posters have just arrived with protecting the most at risk, Plan B for when the virus is surging again in schools, and the preservation of bubbles which were meant to help isolate the virus in schools by keeping children apart. And so we are trying to engage now in discussions with school workers right across the borough, thousands of school workers. We've seen a big increase in our membership, including amongst support staff. and we want to use that as an opportunity to talk to them about how we are going to, how we can take steps to make our workplaces safer, because we cannot rely simply on the law. We have legislation that in words is designed to protect us, but I don't think there is one worker in my workplace who would be able to confidently say that they feel safe every day at work. But it's not just the health crisis, obviously. And comrades hopefully will come in to kind of develop some of the points about the impact of the economic crisis that is developing, and how that might be also compounded by whatever might come out of the Brexit negotiations. But we've already seen the great thanks after all the collapse earlier in the pandemic for key workers and public sector workers. We've seen Sunak announce another pay freeze for public sector workers, concentrating apparently on the relative rise for public sector workers in wages in the last year, ignoring the fact that the last decade we've seen a huge decline in public sector wages, and trying to play public off against private sector as his strategy to try and head off any sort of serious challenge to that. I'm sure comrades on this call will also talk about the impact of cuts as well, particularly in local government. We've seen councils like Croydon and Bexley here in London announcing huge financial deficits, and in the case of Croydon, the question of bankruptcy. And so while many in the trade union movement, I'm sure, will be certainly at the tops, will be looking to the end of the pandemic to return to a kind of a period of relative peace and quiet for them, and not having to deal with some of the thorny questions of people staying alive, that actually there will be no let up for the working class whatsoever, that we will emerge from a health crisis faced by crisis in our public services, in our ability to pay the rent and the mortgage, and to put food on the table and keep our homes warm. So we need to draw some of the lessons of the huge mistakes that have been made during the pandemic by the trade union movement. And I would squarely put my union at the forefront of that in terms of mistakes, partly because we're seeing them played out as a slow motion car crash at the moment. But we've seen that trade union leaders, even those well-meaning ones who might want to use the opportunity to confront government, unable to do that because they're unable to draw the conclusions that are necessary, which is that we need to build the base, but that needs to be built around a program and a strategy. It does require serious planning now. The imposition of the Trade Union Act has had an impact on the way that we can work. I think if the Trade Union Act wasn't there, we could have seen a much quicker move to strike action in a number of places over the question of COVID. And obviously in this discussion, we should talk about the impact of the anti-trade union laws, how we circumvent them, how we potentially break them, but also how we use some of the kind of deep organising strategies that have been missing really from the toolbook of the British trade union movement in terms of building strength at the base to be able to build on, to win ballots and to win campaigns. So my 20 minutes is almost up. Fiona's going to give, I think, a bit more of a case study of her work in the UCU during the pandemic. And obviously there are a number of comrades on this call who can also chip in with their experiences, but it's also really important that we pose questions about the way forward, what our immediate demands around COVID are, and how we can develop demands and a strategy around the question of the pay freeze and cuts as well, and use that really to come out of this discussion with a much more sharpened analysis and clear conclusions of what we need to do on Monday morning when we're back in work, but also what we need to be raising in trade union meetings and conferences and with our colleagues. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks for that, James. So like James said, we're going to bring in Fiona next, speak for around 10 minutes. What I'm just going to post in the chat is the attendance form. So if people haven't filled it in yet in a previous session, if you could just put your names and your details in the attendance form, that would be brilliant. So I'll post that in the chat in a second. And Fiona, do you want to go ahead?
Hello there, everyone and comrades. So I'm Fiona. I'm a member of Socialist Alternative in Manchester. I'm also a rep with the University and College Union up in Manchester. I wanted to talk a bit more about some of the practical stuff that's been happening. So I'm going to talk about my own experiences in UCU, but so some general examples that I think kind of highlight how workers have actually been taking on all these fights and organising in the workplaces. I really want to look at two different types of organising that have happened, I think are important here. So there's organising in the actual workplaces where they have stayed open, where workers are still there, they're going in every day and have been throughout the lockdown. And then look a little bit, referring to my own experiences, for workers who have had to move to a working from home model. So quite a lot of us have kind of had to go and suddenly be thrown into a very different way of working and organising. So I was going to say a bit about those two things as well. Now, I think James has set out a really good view of all the current situation. Basically, we're seeing during this pandemic kind of, I think, two different prongs of attacks from the employers. We're seeing accelerated attacks in terms of things they'd kind of wanted to be doing anyway, things that were already on the cards, things like offshoring, redundancies, all those kind of things that they've accelerated during this lockdown. Now, there's 2 points to that, I think. There's making workers pay for the crisis, but there's also taking an advantage of the situation, taking advantage of the difference in the working situation and the pandemic going forward. And I'll go through a few examples. Hopefully I'll have time to go through everything that I want to talk about. We've also obviously had to very rapidly take up urgent fights on health and safety. And as James is detailing, and I'm sure comrades here and people who've come to this discussion will know, that's been a very urgent fight, and it's been across a wide variety of workplaces. All those different workplaces have had to take that on board in a way that they haven't necessarily had to do before. Now, one of the key points, I think, for us organising on the ground as reps and as trade unionists was to kind of get up on all that health and safety laws. I mean, that's certainly in my workplace, I was aware of them, you know, as someone who teaches in university, but actually having to get in there and have a look at them and see what they say. Often some of the national union reps were kind of pointing towards those health and safety laws, say, you know, you go and use them, but you've got to read them and make sure you know what they are to kind of know their limitations, as James was alluding to as well. You have to kind of know what they are, to kind of know how they can be used. How can you use them as a trade unionist? Where are they actually useful? Where do you need to do some other sort of organising? And that was certainly key for me in my workplace. We have seen some examples of health and safety laws being used, but maybe not in the way they were intended. And I think that's what's interesting to us as trade unionists. There's a couple of examples I want to bring up of people in the workplace probably know about Section 44, this kind of right to walk away from a dangerous workplace. If you read it, it's very much an individual law. The individual can make this decision to walk away. There'll be no detriment. There's very much, you know, we've been told in our union that's not supposed to be used as a collective type of action. However, we have seen some examples of it being used. There's a couple of examples. There was a Warrington sourcing office with the postal workers where a manager had tested positive for COVID, was still working. Workers, I think each went up to the door and basically refused to go in. So it's an individual action, but taken collectively. The workers were kind of outside, going up one by one and refusing to work for the reason that there hadn't been a deep clean, there hadn't been any period of isolation for those who had come into contact with that manager. There's also the example of in Bradford University, in Unison there, some of the office workers were expected still to carry out a lot of face-to-face work, and had been expecting some sort of proper PPE and screens around their desks. They turned up at work, the screens weren't high enough, they weren't adequate, and they again walked out, citing Section 44, and this is a dangerous workplace. We're going to walk out, and actually were able to force the employer then to provide what they deemed necessary in their offices as well, and get those screens put in. What we've also seen as well, which comes back to kind of what I was saying before, really, is victimization of workplace reps. So something that I think is some employers have had on the cards for a while and have taken taken advantage of a situation where it's maybe harder or more difficult or more complex to organise solidarity. So one that comes to mind is there's a case of an Usdaw rep at IKEA who was just organising, demanding for basic sick pay for workers in IKEA, that they wouldn't go without pay if they had to take time off, and was dismissed for that. And there's a big solidarity campaign that went nationwide, and I think he's ended up not being restated, but kind of taken a settlement in lieu of going to a tribunal. But that's a long-standing rep, is kind of they've taken the opportunity to kind of get rid of him. We've also got the current example of a teaching rep in Kerr who has been raising safety concerns and has been suspended. And again, you know, it's something that is just a very natural thing to be doing as a trade unionist, and finding yourself kind of suspended from a job that you've been in for a very long time, and the need to actually organise and try and build solidarity in a different way. Now, I think that the need for solidarity is key, obviously, both within workplaces, but across workplaces at the moment. I think one of the key things to organising in a workplace now is to try and spread out and then try and get the message and be talking to other people in different workplaces, even though it may be not more logistically difficult. And we're seeing fights on redundancies, on pay freezes, on conditions. So those things that are ongoing, those things that were on the cards beforehand and are ongoing now during the lockdown, during the pandemic. Again, come back to these ideas of the employers taking advantage of the situation to drive through things that they had wanted to for a while. So the big example we've got at the moment in the Northwest is the Rolls-Royce factory at Barnoldswick. Workers there have been on strike. There's been a plan to offshore the jobs at the factory, to shut down the factory for I think it's been on the cards for quite a while. And the workers have been on strike to argue against the job losses, about 350 job losses. What's happened is the employers have taken advantage of the furlough scheme. They've said, we're going to lock down the factory. If you're on strike, you're not going to get put on furlough. If you are, if you're not on strike, rather, you'll get put on furlough. If you are on strike, it's tough. You're not going to get anything. That's it's a very severe escalation, and using the kind of schemes that are being put in place supposedly to kind of help workers, to use against workers, and it's something that we need to look at tactically there. Tactics there that may be useful are things like the Debenham workers in Ireland, where you're talking about blockading stores, stopping things leaving from the stores, you know, blockading the ability of the employers to take things out of those workplaces, and we'll see if we see an escalation on those levels. We're going to see pay freeze actions. We've seen it in the Rail Workers Union. There's going to be a strike in Manchester starting tomorrow on pay freeze, and obviously we've seen a public sector pay freeze. We're going to see that coming up as well, and they've managed to organise picket lines. We've also seen the Uber Eats couriers in Sheffield as another example of workers who would normally be quite disparate and not organised in a workplace, but actually able to get together and have a strike a few days ago, and that's on pay conditions and disciplinaries and things like this. They've managed to do that. Now, if you want to talk a little bit about the practicalities of organising, the barriers to organising, having to adapt to things that we would normally do, whether you're in a workplace or out of a workplace. Things like meetings, how can you hold meetings, getting advice from your reps, how can you even hold a picket line, are you allowed to hold a picket line, what are your rights on those kind of things. Now, the first one to talk about is picket lines, really. There was an example of a bus factory, the Optare bus factory, who were organising, they were out on strike, they were organising socially distanced pickets. Police turned up and moved them along, said you're not allowed to do this, you have to leave. And there's a legal challenge there by Unite, and it was ruled in court that it's a fundamental right to strike and you are allowed to picket. So that's an important ruling, and it's again useful for people to know that and be aware of that. We had an example in Manchester of a bus depot where there was the rep was suspended, and it was actually it was actually the local workers' movement that came to help. It was a very difficult situation. It wasn't a legal ballot, but people rallied around and actually blockaded the bus garage on behalf of the workers, which was a really great example of solidarity. Again, the police came out and tried to challenge this, but were actually couldn't really do a great deal, to be quite honest, because there was maybe 20 people there who didn't work there, who were just slowing the buses down and not letting them go. So again, that idea of you have a problem in your workplace, reaching out as well to the riders' movement in this situation to work around things is really key. We've also seen things of social distance meetings. So we've seen examples of health workers, for example, going out on lunch breaks, organising large socially distanced meetings. And as an example, I was hoping to get a picture, but I'm not very, I don't really have enough time, but of health workers in New York having a big meeting all spread out and being able to do that in this situation. We've seen examples of the bakers' unions having surgeries with reps, but having screens around them and PPE on. So if you're there at work in a food factory, you're able to go along and speak to your rep still whilst you're there at work. And I think those are really important. In terms of organising when you're working at home, I mean, that's been my experience in the university union. At the beginning of the first lockdown, the campuses generally locked down. We had to very quickly adapt to organising in a very different way. What was really key to us was we were actually on strike right up until that first lockdown. We'd built informal networks. We'd built WhatsApp groups, email groups, things that were included our members but weren't the official structures of the union, so we could then immediately use those to actually organise in this working from home situation. And the idea that we weren't allowed to picket anymore, I mean, that was something that unfortunately we were told by kind of our regional offices and things, but obviously it turns out that wasn't the case. You know, we were told you have to stop picketing and go home now, but we obviously we were able to kind of fight that and argue against that. What we've actually been able to do because we have these networks, we've been able to organise quite big members meetings now. I know some unions haven't been able to organise meetings in lockdown, but I think in the university union, in some branches, we have been able to do that. We were maybe getting 30 to 40 in physical meetings. We've been able to get like regularly 100 people on online union meetings in our branch, which has been really important for us going forward, and it's going to inform, I think, how we actually organised going forward in terms of having workers that are quite spread out coming together to talk regularly with each other. We've also seen a couple of examples of successful strike ballots that have been held at universities. Universities, again, who can't organise the big sort of meetings you would normally have to get the vote out, have forced to go online, forced to do ring rounds, forced to use social media. We've seen Heriot Watt in Edinburgh threatened with compulsory redundancies, a successful strike ballot, were threatening to go out. The employer backed down immediately, took compulsory redundancies off the table. So that's been a really good victory. We're also seeing in Brighton, there's been threats there to cut the IT services at the university. There was a ballot and a 60% turnout, so beating that 50% threshold. It's so difficult normally, even under this current situation, be able to beat that and actually get that turnout and then set some strike days now going forward. And it's important to know as well that just because you're working at home doesn't mean you can't withdraw your labour. I mean, I've been told this by certain people in the union. You know, it's all about picketing. You know, yes, ideally, yes, it is all about picketing. But what is it really about? It's about withdrawing your labour. If you're working at home, you can still withdraw your labour. You can still do that. You can still take that action going forward. So I think, just to sum up, I think overall, certainly what we found, and I think James said this as well, is that we can't wait for the national trade union leaderships to move. They are just not going to do it. Where we've found successful action, certainly in my union and other unions, is to get organised on the ground as shop stewards, as union members, and do it ourselves basically, and recruit to the union on that basis, get people in as reps, in as health and safety reps. We've certainly seen an increase in that in a similar way to has been reported in some other unions like the NEU. Also important is linking up the different struggles. So for me in the universities, it's important for us to be linking up the students. You'll have seen all the students, student campaigning, student rent strikes. Key for us was immediately linking up with those students, linking up with that struggle against the same people who are causing these issues, and that needs to kind of go wider. I think there's an urgent need to roll out that type of solidarity on the ground with all the different movements that spring up. We need to learn from each other, learn from the tactics, inspire each other to try and improve our conditions, and obviously find ways around organising at the moment, not just stick to what we know, but try and look at all these different movements. How did the Black Lives Matter movement get all those people out on the street? You know, that's an important thing for us to think about as trade unionists. How are people organising? How are they doing these things, and adapting and learning from that? And I think that's the way we're going to be able to challenge the system that puts us in this position and go forward and fight for a better system. Thanks.